They said he was crazy, a man with nothing, building something for no one. Out on the edge of town, where the wind cuts through silence and the dust knows every secret, he hammered boards in a place, day after day, beneath a sun that spared no mercy. Folks rode by shaking their heads. What kind of fool build a shelter with no one to fill it? They whispered. But he never answered. He just kept building, one plank at a time, one prayer deeper into the dirt. The saloon laughed first. Then the general store joined in. Even the preacher, with kind eyes and weary hands, muttered that maybe the sun had finally broken him. Yet there was something about the man's silence, something about the way he looked at the horizon, as if expecting something no one else could see. The shelter stood empty, silent, waiting like a question carved in wood, holding its breath for an answer no one thought would come. Winter crept in. The town grew colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Families tightened their doors. Children learned to look away from strangers. It was safer that way. But still, the man lit a lantern in the shelter every night. No locks, no signs, just warmth, just faith, and maybe hope. People mocked what they didn't understand. But hope, in the Old West, is a dangerous thing to laugh at. Then, something happened. On the coldest night of the season, a woman and her baby arrived, shivering, barefoot, lost. He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't ask anything. He just opened the door. That was all. But that single act, unseen by most, echoed louder than any sermon ever preached. By morning, word had spread, and by sunrise, something no one predicted filled the dusty road. They came. First, a rancher with a basket of eggs. Then a widow with warm bread. By mid-morning, over 100 folks stood in line, not to be saved, but to serve, to give. Because in a land hardened by dust and gunpowder, one man dared to build something not for profit, not for glory, but for love. And somehow, the whole town remembered what it meant to be human. The man's name was Eli. No one knew much about him, other than the fact he had drifted into town the previous spring with nothing but a mule, a Bible, and a hammer. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink. And he sure didn't talk more than he had to. Folks in those parts were used to men with guns and grudges, not quiet ones with calloused hands and a steady gaze. Yet something in Eli's presence stirred discomfort. Not fear, but something older, like a memory you forgot you had. Eli had claimed a piece of abandoned land just outside the town's edge, where the prairie met the hills, and where the wind carried whispers from a world that no longer existed. There, with no audience and no permission, he began building. He didn't ask for nails, didn't borrow tools, just worked from dawn to dusk, as if answering a silent call. And even when storms rolled in or coyotes howled close, he stayed, working, praying, building something only he seemed to understand. The structure itself wasn't fancy, just wood and stone, shaped into a modest shelter with a fire pit, 2 bunks, and a roof that didn't leak. But the way he built it, careful, deliberate, almost sacred, made it feel like something more. Some said it was a church. Others said it was a place for ghosts. A few muttered it was where he'd lose his mind for good. But Eli never corrected them. His eyes stayed on the sky. His hands stayed on the work. The town, meanwhile, moved on. People had cattle to feed, crops to mend, and reputations to uphold. They had no time for a mystery man building a shelter for shadows. A few men from the saloon rode out one afternoon to poke fun, tossed a few jokes, asked Eli when the wedding was since he was building a honeymoon suite. He didn't flinch, just offered them water and went back to work. They never returned, but the story of his silence spread faster than any insult could. Then came the fire. A lightning storm hit a small homestead on the outskirts, setting a family's barn ablaze. Eli was the first to arrive, even before the neighbors. He helped save the livestock, wrapped the children in his coat, and stayed until the flames died out. He said nothing, just nodded and walked away at sunrise. That night, the shelter's lantern burned a little brighter, and though no one dared say it aloud, folks started to wonder, maybe Eli wasn't building for no one after all. By the end of autumn, whispers had turned into watchful eyes. People noticed how Eli's shelter never closed its doors. Not for rain, not for wind, not for anyone. Even the drifters who wandered into town and usually got chased off were seen resting there. They left fed, warmer, calmer. They never stayed long, but they always tipped their hat to Eli on the way out. And slowly, the air around town began to shift. Suspicion started giving way to curiosity. Then, to something like respect. One evening, a child disappeared. Sarah McKinley's boy, Jacob, hadn't come home after tending the goats. Panic gripped the town like a vice. Search parties were formed. Torches lit. Men hollered through the hills. And just as hope began to fade, Eli came walking out of the woods, the boy in his arms, safe, tired, but unharmed. When asked how he found him, Eli simply said he wasn't lost. He was listening. No one quite knew what that meant, but it stuck to their ribs like stew on a cold night. The sheriff, a man not known for warmth, took to riding past Eli's shelter every few days. Not to question him, but to observe. He'd stop near the fence, tip his hat, and sometimes offer supplies, cans, rope, or coffee. It was unspoken, but clear. Something about Eli made people remember the better parts of themselves, the parts they thought the frontier had beaten out of them. In Eli's silence, folks began to hear things they'd forgotten: dignity, humility, grace. And so, when the first blizzard of the season struck, it was no surprise to see lanterns lit all night at the shelter. Eli took in an old widow whose stove had failed, a wounded ranch hand left behind by his employer, even a drunkard who had once mocked him at the saloon. No one was turned away. No names were asked. Just warmth, food, and a place to rest. He had built a shelter for no one, but now it was sheltering everyone. When dawn broke after the storm, the town stood still. Snow lay thick, and chimneys smoked like exhausted lungs. But outside Eli's shelter, something impossible had taken shape. Dozens of people stood, bundled in scarves and blankets, holding food, firewood, and whatever kindness they could carry. One by one, they stepped forward, not for refuge, but for redemption. Because sometimes, in a land of dust and steel, the strongest thing a man can build is a reason for others to care again. The scene that morning felt almost holy. No one spoke loudly, and no one laughed, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was as if the prairie itself had hushed to watch. A little girl laid down a jar of honey on the porch. A wrinkled blacksmith offered 2 fresh horseshoes, polished like silver. Even a banker's wife, once too proud to walk on dirt, brought biscuits she'd made herself. Eli didn't refuse anything. He accepted each gift with quiet eyes and a nod that somehow made every offering feel sacred. In the days that followed, the shelter began to transform. Not in its structure, it remained the same, but in its spirit. It became a place where burdens were quietly left behind and strangers became neighbors without needing a word. Men who hadn't spoken in years found themselves fixing a fence together. Children who had never played outside their own yards now shared stew by the fire. Eli didn't organize any of it. He didn't lead. He simply was. And somehow, that was enough. One night, a rider arrived from out east, mud on his boots and blood on his coat. He'd been robbed, beaten, and left with nothing but his life. The doctor was away, and no one knew what to do. But Eli took him in. He boiled water, cleaned wounds, whispered words no one else could hear. The man slept for 3 days straight, and when he woke, he cried. Not because he was hurt, but because someone had cared. In a world that usually kicked a man when he was down, Eli's shelter had offered something rare: mercy. People began calling it the Lantern House, even though it had no official name. The light in the window never went out, no matter the hour or the storm. And the strange thing was folks began to depend on that glow. It reminded them that somewhere, just beyond the edge of town, a man believed in something bigger than himself. Something that didn't need applause or reward. Something that could outlast the noise and dust of the frontier. Something that felt a lot like faith. Still, no one really knew what Eli's past was. Some guessed he was a preacher who'd lost his church. Others swore he'd once been a gunslinger who laid down his iron after seeing too much blood. But the truth was simpler and heavier. Eli had once built a home, far from here. A home for his wife and son, both taken by a fever that came fast and left only silence. He had buried them with his own hands. And then he walked west, not to run from the past, but to build something in their honor. Not a tomb, a shelter, for anyone who needed one. Winter eventually loosened its grip, and the thaw revealed more than just soil. It uncovered change. The town, once marked by silence and suspicion, now pulsed with quiet unity. People began repairing their neighbors' fences without being asked. Leftovers weren't thrown away. They were packed and sent to the Lantern House. A sense of shared life had returned, not through sermons or laws, but through one man's unspoken defiance of indifference. The general store started leaving a crate outside labeled for Eli's guests. Blankets, matches, flour. It filled up faster than anyone expected. No one was told to contribute. They just did. And that crate became a mirror of what people had once forgotten. The frontier wasn't just about survival. It was about looking out for one another. Eli hadn't preached. He hadn't rallied. But his shelter had reignited something buried deep. The code of the West, where a man's worth wasn't in his words, but in his deeds. Then, one afternoon, a storm unlike any before rolled in. Wind screamed through the hills. Trees bent. Roofs cracked. It was the kind of storm that made even the bravest cowboys pray. People huddled indoors, except for Eli. While others secured their homes, he rode out, looking for those too weak to find shelter themselves. He pulled an old miner from a collapsed shed. He rescued a boy trapped in a wagon. And when the storm finally broke, Eli was soaked, bruised, and smiling beneath a sky split with lightning. Word of his actions spread quickly, not through newspapers or telegrams, but through tears and trembling voices. The kind that carried weight heavier than any bullet. That night, fires were lit in dozens of homes, not just for warmth, but in honor, in remembrance, and out of gratitude for a man who built something out of nothing, for no one, and ended up saving everyone. But the greatest shift came not from the grown men or the church bells. It came from the children. They began to gather around the shelter after chores, listening to Eli's quiet stories, helping carry buckets, drawing pictures in the dirt. He taught them how to patch holes in roofs, how to read the stars, how to listen when words weren't enough. And without realizing it, Eli had built something even greater than a shelter. He had built a legacy, a silent, living legacy that would outlive the wood, the storms, and even the man himself. As spring bloomed across the plains, Eli's shelter stood tall, not because of its height or grandeur, but because of what it had become. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a memory in the making. One morning, a schoolteacher arrived with her students, asking if they could help clean the yard. She didn't explain why, and Eli didn't ask. The children raked, swept, and planted flowers around the edges. When they finished, they each placed a stone near the entrance. Not labeled, not claimed, just left there in silence. A tribute without words. Eli never changed. He still rose before the sun and lit the lantern every night. Still spoke softly, still worked slowly, still listened more than he talked. But those around him began to change in ways that couldn't be measured. The saloon owner stopped charging for water. The blacksmith trained an orphan in secret. A widow took in a drifter with frostbite and called him son before he could walk again. No one called it charity. They called it the way things are now. Then came a moment that no one expected. A group of outlaws rode through town, rough men, armed and scarred by a lifetime of taking. The sheriff was out on business. People braced for the worst. But before any gun was drawn, Eli stepped out from his shelter, walked straight into the middle of the street, and stood still. He didn't threaten, didn't beg. He simply stood, with the wind in his coat and a look that cut deeper than bullets. The men stopped, looked at him, and turned around. No one knew why. Maybe they'd heard of him. Maybe they'd seen something in his eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, they couldn't bring themselves to defile something so pure. Whatever the reason, that moment sealed Eli's place in the hearts of the people. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was a guardian. Not with guns, but with presence. Not with noise, but with quiet strength. The kind you only find in men who have lost everything and still choose to build. In the weeks that followed, a visitor arrived from the railroad company, offering to buy the land and replace the shelter with a station. Promised money. Promised progress. But the town voted against it unanimously. Not because they hated trains, but because they knew that some things shouldn't be replaced. The shelter had become more than wood and stone. It was the soul of the town. And for once, the soul came before profit. For once, they remembered who they were, and who had reminded them. Eli never asked for thanks, but gratitude found him in ways beyond words. One morning, he woke to find the shelter's roof freshly shingled, done during the night by hands too humble to take credit. Another evening, someone left a carved wooden plaque by the entrance that simply read, "Home." He didn't move it. He didn't comment. but he dusted it every morning like it was something sacred. Because it was. An old man from the mountains, known for keeping to himself, rode into town with a mule and a riddle. He'd heard tales of the man who built for no one and wanted to see if it was true. He stayed 3 nights in the shelter. Didn't speak much. On the 4th morning, he left a silver pocket watch hanging from the beam above the fire. No note, no explanation, just the sound of the door closing behind him. That watch never ticked again, but Eli kept it there, like a heartbeat that had found rest. Then, one night, a woman in labor arrived, carried on a wagon half frozen from the trail. There was no midwife available, no time to wait. Eli lit every lantern in the shelter and turned it into a cradle of warmth. By dawn, the cries of a newborn echoed through the walls. And as the mother wept and laughed in equal measure, someone whispered she was born in the house of mercy. The child was named Hope. No last name, just Hope. And from that day on, the shelter wasn't just a refuge. It was a birthplace. People started writing letters, not to Eli, but to the idea of him. Letters to the lost, the grieving, the wandering. Letters left in the cracks of the shelter's walls, under stones by the fire, in jars on the porch. Words that might never be read, but needed to be written. Eli never said whether he read them, but somehow, the weight of those words softened his steps, as if he knew that even pain, when shared, could be holy. And then came a boy, barefoot, speechless, eyes wide with hunger. He'd traveled alone for 2 days, escaping something no child should ever face. Eli wrapped him in a blanket, fed him stew, and sat beside him without asking a thing. Days passed. The boy still didn't speak. Until one evening, as the lantern flickered and the wind sang low through the cracks, the boy whispered, "Are you my father?" Eli didn't answer right away. He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "I can be." And from that moment on, the boy never left. The boy's name was Jonah. He never spoke of where he came from, and Eli never pressed. What mattered wasn't the past, but the healing. Under Eli's watch, Jonah learned to whittle wood, gather firewood before dawn, and cook stew thick enough to chase away the cold. But more than anything, he learned the value of silence. Not the kind born of fear, but the kind born of understanding. It was the first time he felt safe, not because he was hidden, but because he was seen. People from surrounding towns began to hear stories. Tales passed from ranch to ranch, whispered in railway cars, spoken over campfires. Not legends of gold or revenge or duels at noon. No, this story was quieter, yet it carried farther. A story of a shelter built not with blueprints, but with pain turned into purpose. Travelers detoured just to glimpse it, not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. And in a world where truth was rare, that made it sacred. One day, a preacher came to visit. He'd heard of the Lantern House and brought with him a Bible, worn and wrapped in leather, claiming it once belonged to a circuit rider who'd vanished in the desert decades ago. He handed it to Eli without a word. Eli took it gently, as if recognizing something familiar. He didn't preach, didn't quote it, just placed it near the fire, beside the watch, as if saying, "I remember." And in that simple gesture, the past and present shook hands. The town began holding gatherings at the shelter, not formal, not planned. Just people showing up with pies and guitars, sitting by the fire, trading stories in silence in equal measure. Children sang songs older than their grandparents. Men wept without shame. Women danced without judgment. It became a place where life was stitched back together, not all at once, but piece by piece, where even the broken fell whole again, if only for a night. Jonah, once a ghost in his own skin, started leading others. He read aloud from books, showed newcomers where to find blankets, even carved wooden toys to leave under the bunks for the next child who wandered in. He became the heartbeat of the shelter, guided not by blood, but by love inherited from a man who'd given without asking. And as the town watched, they began to understand. Eli hadn't just built a home, he'd built a future. Then came a summer so dry that even the wind felt like fire. Wells dried up, crops withered, tempers flared. It was the kind of season that tested every inch of a man's soul. But the shelter's door remained open. Eli and Jonah took in families, shared what little water they had, and cooked soup thinner than hope, but served it with a smile. People came not because they expected comfort, but because they knew they'd find courage. One afternoon, a traveler collapsed on the trail, just miles from town. sunburned, delirious, barely breathing. Jonah found him while fetching wood and hauled him back on his own shoulders. Eli tended to him like he did all others, gently, thoroughly, silently. The traveler woke 2 days later and said, with cracked lips, "I thought I was dying, but then I saw the light." No one told him it was just a lantern, because they all knew it wasn't. That summer, people stopped locking their doors. Not out of naivety, but out of renewal. They remembered what it meant to live in a place where trust outweighed fear. They shared food again, mended each other's fences without asking for payment. When the well at the town square dried, half the town came to help dig a new one, led by Jonah, shovel in hand, sweat on his brow, Eli's quiet strength behind every swing. And yet, Eli began to slow. His walks grew shorter, his silences deeper. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it, like a candle flickering at the end of the wick. One evening, he sat by the fire while Jonah read aloud. His eyes didn't close, but his breath softened, as if listening to something far away. The town waited, not with fear, but with reverence. Because if he was leaving, he was doing so in the home he'd built, surrounded by the lives he had mended. But Eli didn't leave. Not that night. Not yet. Instead, he stood, placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder, and whispered, "You know what to do." Then he walked outside and sat on the porch, watching the stars rise like embers across the dark. The lantern still burned. So did the fire. And so did the hearts of everyone who had ever passed through those doors, forever marked by a man who had built a shelter for no one and given everyone a place to belong. Autumn returned with golden light and softer winds, and with it came a quiet rhythm, one the town had grown to cherish. The lantern house still stood firm, not out of stubbornness, but out of sacred purpose. Its walls, once empty, now echoed with laughter, prayers, and stories whispered in candlelight. And though Eli spoke less each day, his presence filled the air like a hymn no one wanted to stop singing. The shelter no longer needed a sign. Its name lived on the lips of those it saved. One day, a stranger rode into town, a woman wrapped in dust, her eyes heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. She didn't speak for hours, just sat on the shelter's porch with her hands clasped tightly. Eli offered her water. Jonah offered a smile. And when night came, she finally spoke. "I had a daughter. She died last winter. I haven't felt the sun since." Eli didn't offer answers, just a blanket, a seat near the fire. And when she cried, no one turned away. Because in that house, every sorrow found rest. The mayor, once a man of tight suits and tighter rules, began spending Sundays at the shelter, not for politics, but to split wood, tell jokes, and remember the boy he used to be. He brought his wife and daughters, taught them how to make bread from scratch, how to listen without judgment. And over time, he stopped being Mayor Caldwell and became Henry again. Because in the lantern house, titles dissolved and truth remained. Jonah, now taller, stronger, and wiser, began adding to the shelter, not changing it but extending it. A second room for women and children, a shed out back for tools and grain. He carved stories into the beams, small messages, hidden where only the curious would find them. "You matter. It's okay to cry here. This house remembers." He didn't sign his name. He didn't need to. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it was clear he carried Eli's spirit now. And still, Eli watched. From the porch, from the garden, from beside the fire. His body slowed, but his eyes held fire. Every newcomer, every broken heart, every lost soul who crossed the threshold met the same gaze, a gaze that said, "You're not alone." And so, when a child once asked, "Is he a saint?" Jonah smiled and answered, "No, he's just a man who decided to love without waiting to be asked." And in that answer, the legend became truth. Then, one quiet morning, with the frost beginning to creep along the windows and the birds silent in the trees, Eli didn't rise. Jonah found him by the fire, blanket around his shoulders, hands resting on his lap, eyes closed in peace. There was no struggle, no fear, just a stillness that felt like reverence. He had gone away he had lived, gently, humbly, without needing applause. And when the town heard, they didn't wail. They came in silence, bearing flowers, bread, and tears. They didn't bury Eli in the churchyard. They laid him to rest beneath the old tree near the shelter, where the lantern's glow could still touch his grave. Children left drawings. Women left letters. Men left tools, horseshoes, old coins. And every gift said the same thing: thank you. For the rest of that day, the fire in the shelter was never allowed to fade. Jonah kept it lit. So did the mayor. So did the widow. So did 100 others. Because some flames must never die. And though his body rested beneath the earth, Eli lived on. In every meal shared. In every song sung. In every stranger welcomed without question. Jonah became the keeper of the house, but not its owner. No one owned it. It belonged to everyone, and in that belonging, it remained sacred. Travelers continued to arrive, not for answers, but for warmth. And when they asked who built the place, the answer was always the same: a man who built a shelter for no one, and ended up saving us all. Years passed. The town grew. Roads changed. But the lantern house remained untouched, preserved by memory, love, and hands that refused to let it fade. Jonah, now a man, would often sit where Eli once did, watching the sunset paint gold across the sky. And when children asked about the old man in the photograph by the fire, he'd smile and say, "He was the one who showed us the way back to each other." And so, under the stars, beside the fire, and in the quiet moments between storms and songs, Eli's shelter continued to breathe, not just as wood and stone, but as a testament that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion in a broken world is to build something beautiful without needing a reason, and to keep the light burning for those still on the way home. In the heart of the Old West, where life was measured in miles and scars, one man dared to build something not for himself, but for someone he had never met. Eli didn't chase justice with a gun or carve his name in a stone. He built a simple shelter with open doors, a warm fire, and a light that never went out. And somehow, that light reached farther than any bullet, echoing louder than any sheriff's badge. Because what he built wasn't a house, it was a promise. Every soul that crossed his threshold carried something: grief, shame, loneliness, and each one left lighter, not because Eli fixed them, but because he made space for them. That shelter reminded an entire town that love isn't loud. It's quiet. It's consistent. And most of all, it's given freely. Eli's story teaches us that even in the harshest landscapes, where hope is scarce and trust is costly, kindness can still bloom like wildflowers through cracked earth. The legacy he left behind didn't require monuments or medals. It lived in the hands of a boy named Jonah, in the prayers of widows, and in the way strangers started calling each other family again. What Eli gave to the world was the courage to believe that no one is ever too broken to build, and no act of compassion is ever wasted, no matter how small. Sometimes, all it takes is one light in the dark to help hundreds find their way home. So now, ask yourself, what are you building? Are your hands shaping something that will outlive your name? Are your words opening doors, or closing them? Maybe you don't need a blueprint. Maybe, like Eli, all you need is a reason that lives beyond yourself. Because in a world that often demands noise and spectacle, the most powerful thing you can do is quietly care. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to share your thoughts below. What would your version of a lantern house look like? Leave a comment. Like the video if it moved your heart. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories that heal, that challenge, that remind us of who we are, subscribe to the channel. We'll keep the fire burning for you, and for everyone still searching for a light in the dark.